Thank you again for everyone joining us today. I'm Ari Shah. I'm a senior fellow and director of international programs at the Williams Institute. And for this last panel, we're going to telescope out even a little further and look at how US engagement with the world, and specifically in terms of border and migration policy, are playing out and impacting LGBTQ people here in California. Just to kind of set the context a little bit, according to the UN Refugee Agency, there are 100 million people, more than 100 million people that are currently forcibly displaced, and more than 40 million refugees and asylum seekers fleeing violence or persecution in their country of origin. Closer to home, US Customs and Border Protection reported more than 300,000 encounters at the southwest border in December of 2023 alone. California is home to nearly a quarter of all immigrants in the US, and it's the state with the largest immigration policy. So just at the outset, we're deeply impacted by what's happening in terms of US immigration policy. While the US has historically been among the largest recipient countries in terms of immigration and refugee resettlement, this really unprecedented state of human mobility is being met by an ongoing political stasis when it comes to immigration reform in this country. And a lot of that is playing out in how people within the United States are perceiving this issue. According to Pew, 8 in 10 US adults say that the government is doing a very or somewhat bad job dealing with the large number of migrants that are entering the US. And nearly as many say that the situation is in crisis or a major problem for the United States. So in the midst of this political battle, we have LGBTQ migrants in particular who are facing unique challenges at nearly every point along the migratory route. We're going to get into that in this discussion and dive more deeply into this thorny issue to understand how the political fight around migration and border security is impacting LGBTQ people as they struggle to navigate this precarious landscape of immigration law and policy in the US and more specifically in California. I am joined by an absolutely dream panel of experts here to delve into this. So I want to introduce them briefly so we can get in and save some time for questions at the end as well. To my right, just geographically speaking, is Talia Inlender, Deputy Director of the Center for Immigration Law and Policy here at UCLA School of Law. And Talia spent 13 years at Public Counsel, which is the nation's largest pro bono law firm, where she launched and led the agency's detained deportation defense program, and most recently served as supervising senior staff attorney with the Immigrants' Rights Project. Kennji Kizuka is Director of Asylum Policy for the International Rescue Committee. And prior to that, he was Associate Director of Research and Analysis for Human Rights First. And finally, my dear colleague, Miguel Fuentes, who's a research analyst at the Williams Institute, also the co-author of several recent reports that we're going to discuss, including a series on LGBT immigrants in California and the community survey of trans and non-binary people in Los Angeles that we heard a bit about earlier, but that touched on some of these important aspects of experiences for trans and non-binary immigrants. So I wonder, by way of starting, Talia, if you can help kind of set the scene, what are some of the major drivers for, in terms of global migration, particularly at the US southern border, who's migrating from where, and to the extent we can say so, what are the sort of primary motives for LGBTQ migrants in particular?
So thank you. First of all, is this maybe? Yes, now it is. Okay. Hi, everyone. First, just thank you, Ari, and to the Williams Institute team for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you today. Also, thank you for all of those questions. That's a bundle of questions in one. So I'm going to try to break them down a bit to get us started here. So let's start with the question of what is happening with respect to global migration. And you already kind of previewed it a bit, Ari, that global migration is, in short, on the rise, right? That's no secret. But to set up some context for us, you quoted 100 million. I think what I found in the World Migration Report is 281 million international migrants in 2021, which is almost a 30% increase from a decade before. So we know that sort of people have always been on the move, right? Migration has always been woven into the fabric of humanity, but the numbers do suggest that more than ever, people are on the move today, right? And unsurprisingly, those numbers, the numbers in the Western Hemisphere, in our region of the world, reflect that global trend. So just one example, according to the Migration Policy Institute, last year, there was a 70-fold increase in folks coming up and passing through the Darien Gap, which is the small strip of land that connects South America and Central America, right? So we're seeing a lot more people on the move in our region. And of course, many of those people are headed here to the United States. As Ari shared, the CBP, or Customs and Border Protection encounters were really up at the end of last year. They've gone down a little bit at the start of this year. There's always fluctuation. That encounter data, though, I think you said something, it's a little over 250,000, as I understand it, from December of last year. But just some caveats when you're hearing those numbers and that data, and they're being flashed as crises on the radio. One caveat is, again, they have gone down a bit in recent months, and those numbers are not about discrete individuals. They're actually about encounters, right? So how many times CBP comes into contact with a person. And so if that person is sent back and comes back again, that person is double counted or triple counted or quadruple counted. So you need to take some of these numbers with a grain of salt. But still, it should cause us to reflect. I think that there are folks on the move, and it's something that we need to be not afraid of, but something that we need to be thinking about how we want to respond to this movement that's happening in the world. So we'll get to the why. Why is all this movement happening? But first, let's talk about the who and the where questions that you had. So who's coming, particularly to the U.S.-Mexico border? Single adults make up a little over half, about 54% of who's coming to the border. But a lot more people, at least in the past year, who have arrived have identified as being part of family units. So people arriving with their loved ones, that number's at about 41%. So that's a large number of folks who are not just sort of sending one person from the family, but are uprooting multiple members of their family, or maybe their entire families, in search of safety, protection, or opportunity. Smaller number in the last year of unaccompanied children. As you may know, in the past, there have been larger numbers, and those numbers again fluctuate, but at least within the last year, those numbers have gone down somewhat. And this is where I should insert how many of those folks identify as LGBTQI, but I can't do that because, as we'll talk about later, we don't have that data is not tracked. So we don't have, hard numbers that we can rely on. But we know from folks providing services on both sides of the border that there are hundreds, thousands, likely people coming every year who identify as LGBTQI. So where are folks coming from? This is also a really interesting shift that I think is worth noting in migration patterns. This is a majority of migrants in the past year, slight majority, 51%, but still a majority, are coming from countries other than Mexico and the Northern Triangle countries. So other than Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. What does that mean? People are traveling farther. Their journeys are longer. Their journeys are likely more difficult, at least as if not more difficult than any time in the past. So folks are coming from farther away within our hemisphere. Venezuela, Cuba, Haiti are countries that are that a lot of folks are fleeing right now. We'll talk about that in a moment. But there are people also coming from much farther away. Numbers are up from China, of course, from Ukraine as a result of the invasion. So we're really seeing folks coming from all over the world to our border. So we should turn to the crucial question of why. Why are people coming? Both generally and then with respect to LGBTQI migrants in particular. So generally, I know this was talked about a little in the past panel, just how the coronavirus pandemic maybe feels kind of far in the past, but it's really not in a global sense. So I think some of what we're seeing is the aftermath of the pandemic, and right, at least in U.S. border policy, the policy, the Title 42 order, the so-called public health order that shut our border down was during that pandemic, was only lifted in May of 2023. Which is just hard to even conceive of, but that's when it was lifted. So some of what we're seeing in these numbers is sort of the constraints that have been on movement that have rightly opened up, right, as we've moved away from some of these harmful so-called public health policies. But of course, some of it is also the effect of massive political and economic instability in the region. and in the world. So Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, Haiti are countries where there's significant political and turmoil and economic collapse. And folks are fleeing not just one by one. I think that's partly why you're seeing family units come, is folks are making the decision that they can't safely live in those places and are coming to seek refuge. Of course, global war and conflict is also a big driver of migration right now. Ukraine and Gaza come to mind most readily. And then there's climate instability, right? That's really driving more and more migration in the world today. It particularly affects indigenous communities in Central America, where there's a lot more food instability because of climate change, and people are picking up and needing to leave. So all of those reasons are general, but they all apply also to LGBTQI migrants, who are just as, if not more, affected by some of these political, economic, and climate realities than their neighbors. But we should say, like, it's not all the same, right? And LGBTQI migrants in particular are also fleeing targeted harm and persecution in their home countries. And that has been true for a very long time, and it continues to be true today. So still on the books in 70 countries around the world are laws that criminalize same-sex activity, even consensual same-sex sexual activity. So folks are fleeing these kinds of laws, and in places where there have been legal advances, there's still significant violence, social discrimination, economic discrimination, and just a few examples from our neighborhood, right? In El Salvador, there was a ruling in recent years from the Supreme Court that said that gender identity discrimination is unconstitutional, and yet our State Department has still found that violence against LGBTQI people in El Salvador is widespread, right? So you can have a law on the books, but what it looks like on the ground and people's experiences are really different. Same is true for Mexico, because Mexico's a country that has legalized same-sex marriage now. It's legal nationally, and yet a survey found that more than half of LGBTQI community members within the past year had experienced some kind of discrimination or physical aggression, right? So the laws look really different than what people's experiences, and it's driving people to come to the border and need to move. And Mexico is a particularly important example because, as I said, people are coming from farther and farther away. One of the recent trends in migration is that more people are either choosing or forced to decide to stay in Mexico because of the restrictive US border policies, which we'll talk about. But that's not an option for LGBTQI migrants, right? It's not an option to stay in Mexico or in other places in Central America where they are facing a lot of the same kinds of harms that they do it at home. So those are some of the reasons. And I'm just going to say one more thing, and I'm talking for a long time, but one final and important note on the why people are coming to the border is the failure of our US immigration policy, right? It's just so important to understand that we have consistently failed to provide safe and viable pathways for people seeking protection, like LGBTQI migrants, for families trying to reunify, for people who are seeking opportunities. We have failed to provide policies that allow people to come safely to the United States without going through the border. And that means that the only way for people to meet those needs is to come and seek them at our border. And so it should be no surprise to anybody that they're doing just that. So I'll stop there for now.
No, that's great. Thank you for taking my multitude of questions and distilling down that really clear picture. Kennji, turning to you, so Talia kind of gave us the who and the why. I wonder if you can talk about what things look like at the border in terms of policy and responses. What are the sort of key challenges and bottlenecks? And again, to the extent we know and we can say, how is this impacting LGBTQ migrants in particular?
So I promise I will answer the question, but I'll also fight the hypo a little bit.
Please.
And ask us where the border is. Because for many years, US policy, if we look back to the 90s, pushed borders back. So we know this from when Haitian refugees tried to reach the United States in the late 80s and 90s, the border shifted all the way from the coast of Florida to the coast of Haiti, so that when anyone was intercepted at sea, they could be returned without the application of US refugee law. right? So the US has also started to do that in the land border context, to work with its partners throughout the region to push back border control further and further along the lines. And it's reached as far as now the Darien Gap, where the US is working with the Panamanian government to start to surveil, to collect evidence, to stop and deport people from Panama as far south as Panama. And of course, those enforcement actions happen in Mexico, in Central America, anywhere where the US is working with partner governments. So one question is whether someone will reach the border, the US-Mexico border at all, before we can even talk about what happens when you get to that physical border with the US. And maybe one thing to understand about the US asylum system is that it's been described as refugee roulette. That's a term that scholars have used for many decades now, and it continues to be true. And the border is no exception to that. So for someone who is wanting to seek protection in the US, they've reached Mexico, they've reached northern Mexico, let's say, which is also an ordeal to get out of southern Mexico because of Mexican and US cooperation to enforce and move the border further south. You have, I wouldn't call them options, but there are different pathways that one might take. So of course, in the news, we see people who cross the physical border, the river or by land through the mountains, these dangerous crossings. And that's something that people do out of desperation. They did during the pandemic with Title 42 in place because the ports of entry were physically closed and there was no other option. They do it because they have contracted someone to help them on this journey because it is so difficult to cross all these borders. And that organization controls where they cross. They cross at that physical border because they're in physical danger in the town in northern Mexico where they've arrived to. The other option, we could call it, is to try to go to the port of entry, which is the small places along the border. There's not all that many of them when you think about how long the border is where you can cross. You go up to the line and there's a CBP agent waiting there to check that you have a passport, and if it's not an American passport, a visa, that you have some way to legally enter the US before you can actually physically approach the port of entry building. But these days, asylum seekers can't even really do that because there's a smartphone application that you have to use to pre-schedule an appointment to go to the port of entry to seek asylum. And the thing is that if you don't use the CBP One app and you cross the border elsewhere, or you actually get up to the port of entry and somehow manage to get past that CBP agent to seek asylum, you are barred from asylum under a regulation that came into effect when Title 42 ended in May of last year, that the government calls the circumvention of lawful pathways, but that most of us call the asylum ban. It's in effect for 2 years, which is a little unusual. It's not a permanent ban, but most people don't know about it. Most people here probably don't know about it. Even fewer people seeking asylum know about it. They just know perhaps that there is this app available that you could try to seek this appointment. So you're already facing a lot of uncertainty, a lot of difficulty. You've found out about the app. You're trying to make an appointment. There's a long wait. On average, it's at least 2 months, probably closer to 3 or 4. We hear people 8, 9 months waiting in Mexico. That's without any legal status. That's without any ability to work formally in Mexico. That's in places where it can be quite dangerous for you. And in particular, if you're a queer person, if you're of African descent, if you have an accent that marks you as clearly not Mexican. So for Venezuelans, for people from the Caribbean, it's pretty difficult to pass that you are, a local person, and that makes you a target because the cartels have learned over these past years that migrants who are trapped in the border towns waiting for asylum, they usually have family in the US. That's why they're coming here, because they know there's a community to support them. And that makes them a good target for kidnapping and extortion because someone will pay to save their life. And so there you are. So you're in Mexico, you're waiting many months. Let's say either you decide to cross, you can't wait anymore, you cross the border. Again, this is where the roulette comes into play. You hand yourself in to a Border Patrol agent. Let's say, thank God you didn't cross in Texas, you didn't come across the razor wire barriers that actually physically prevent you from handing yourself in to Border Patrol. The Border Patrol agent gets to make the decision about what happens to you next. They have complete discretion. Do you go to detention? Do you get released and told to wait for your immigration court hearing? Do you get placed in an expedited process where you're likely going to be in detention and you're going to have to show within a matter of days or weeks that you're probably eligible for asylum without an attorney? There's many different sort of pathways that could occur after you come into the custody of the Border Patrol. And again, I think from the news, we see everyone's being released. Somehow there's an open border that Biden administration has just opened us up to allow anyone in. And that is just not the case. The percentage of people who are being placed in detention and in expedited removal has been going up steadily. So the number of people who are in immigration detention is much higher now than when the Biden administration came into office. There are more people in detention than Congress has funded beds. And Congress actually turned around just a couple of weeks ago and increased the funding amount for immigration detention to the highest levels it's been in many years. So one, there is a pretty good chance that you could go into detention after you cross. And if you were an LGBTQ couple, chances are you're coming from a country where you were unable to marry. And so you're likely to be separated from your partner when you're detained. You're not going to be, guaranteed the right to be in the same detention center as your partner. And so we see that happening a lot. And it's people from all over the world. There's many Russian couples who are seeking assistance, who have arrived at the border. We see that quite a bit, actually, who are in detention. And we do have some numbers because advocates have forced ICE to provide the number of detained trans people who are in immigration detention. So we always know that number, although it's usually an undercount because the agency doesn't always count people by their own self-identification. But so we do know that number. That's one of the few that we always have. But otherwise, yeah, we have very limited sense of who is LGBTQ going through the asylum process, of who's gone through the expedited removal process. And then, the same along the route in terms of the asylum process in immigration court or at the asylum office. But the border, the policies, it's inscrutable to those of us who work on it, and even more so for people who are, in their most desperate moments, who are trying to reach this place that they think is a place of safety and find just an incredibly complex and constantly shifting legal and policy environment on top of the kinds of societal discrimination and violence that people face along the way at the border, and then once they are placed in immigration detention or in the custody of Border Patrol. So,
yeah, thanks, Kennji. Fortunately, another area, I should say, where we do have some data, thanks to the great work by Miguel, our colleagues Alana and Kareth and Ruben, are about the experiences and well-being of LGBTQ immigrants in California. And I wonder if you, Miguel, can give us some sense of the day-to-day once folks are in California, through various pathways, what their lives look like.
Thank you, Ari. To begin with, hi everybody, my name is Miguel. When I first started with this project, it was not the first time I encountered these data. Myself, I'm an immigrant. I'm a Latino immigrant, born and raised in Mexico, for being in this country. I got here in 2017 to do my PhD, and I have the fortune to work at the Williams Institute. So I've experienced this in the flesh, and I've experienced this through a lot of my own friends who have been deported, a lot of my students who have been deported, who are queer, brown, and have the bad chance to encounter the police system, immigration system in this country, particularly this state. One of my first reasons to come to California was, well, first, it's close enough to Mexico, so if anything happens to my family, I can go back. And second, because it's supposed to be a very welcoming state for particularly undocumented immigrants, heavily Latino, because this used to be our country. So yeah, and unfortunately, that has not been the experience of a lot of people that are encountering the data that we've had the fortune to find, both in the report that we did on undocumented Latinx LGBTQ immigrants, but also another great project that Carrie and I did together with Trans-Latina Coalition, with Queen Victoria and Bambi Salcedo, and the experience of transgender, non-conforming, and intersex communities here in the LA city, and part of that relation was also immigrant. So the first thing that I want to bring up to you is that there's a huge community of Latino immigrants to the United States, and out of all of it, around a big proportion is undocumented, which wasn't shocking once we find that resembles a lot to what we find in that specific sample that we narrowed to in that report that we published. We find that around a third of the population that we sample is undocumented. We use the label of not having green cards just for the technicality of it. I'm just going to go with an easier term for the audience to be able to follow with me. But that's where that was the category that you'll find in the report. LGBT Latinx people with no green cards. But the reality is the way they're treated is, with these slurs about their documentation. So they don't only represent a big chunk of the people that have immigrated to this country and to this state particularly, but also the opportunities that they have, and this is the biggest takeaway that I want you to get out of this, is affordability of California. If it's already unaffordable for us as inhabitants of this state, even more for queer people, even more for queer people of color, even more for queer people of color immigrating to this country, and even more for those without proper documentation to be able to, have all the other rights that a lot of other people do. Even myself having a student visa and now a work visa, I've struggled with detention in this country. I struggle with ICE asking questions. I struggle with having to be there for people that then don't have access to all these other things. And we find that a big proportion of our population are in that age range where they're supposed to be fulfilling all these fantasy that we have of the dream of America, because we find that around a third go between 25 and 34 years old, and then another third from 34 to 50 years old. And unfortunately, a great chunk of these people do not have access to a lot of choices in employment. More than 2/3 end up working in the service industry. And the other part are either working as self-employed people or they're working without any pay, either in family businesses or around informal markets. So that already starts giving you, a panorama that may look like a bunch of the realities that undocumented populations face. But what makes it worse for the LGBT population is that, compounded to that, they're also facing language barriers. Half of our participants that we found in the CHI survey do not speak fluent English. So that also makes it hard for them to apply for any other form of employment. Based on the study that we had with the Trans-Latina Coalition, we see trans people struggle even more because of the language barrier, because of their gender expression, and then being cornered to only being able to access service employment that doesn't always come with regulations in terms of social security, in terms of proper policies on equity, diversity, and inclusion. Makes it really hard for them on those jobs. And we also find that the grand majority of these people have, at least half of them have lived in this country more than half of their life. So we see them in their 30s, 40s, and there's still a majority of them are staying under the poverty line. And to give just one example out of that project with Trans-Latina Coalition, the majority of the participants of transgender, non-conforming, and intersex immigrants were making less than $15,000 a year in LA. Can you imagine? How is that? And then your only form of employment, because you do not have proper documentation, is service work that's not going to give you any kind of access to healthcare. Then we also find that only 30% of our participants are enrolled in Medicaid, and less than 10% are enrolled in health insurance provided by employees. So imagine the hardship of having to access hormones, access, psychological support to deal with the trauma of having to cross to this country. And if any form of harassment or discrimination you're living for being brown and LGBT in this country alone. We also find that in general terms of well-being, our LGBT undocumented Latinx immigrants are not doing well. Around half of them, 40%, 45% are reporting high levels of distress. They're reporting poor health. And a lot of them don't access healthcare. Like around half of them don't have access to a regular healthcare provider. So then how can you expect for somebody to be in that economically active population, then try to contribute to this community when they don't have access to these services? So I want to wrap up there. Again, the challenges that we've been looking at are affordability of the city and of the state, access to proper housing and healthcare provision, and the compounded discrimination that comes with language barriers, documentation barriers, and to close up with a great example that you can take from home. I recommend you that you watch the Undocumented Career series. It's free online on YouTube, done by undocumented gay and Mexican immigrant that tells you how it is the daily life, being undocumented brown in this state, which is supposed to be a beacon of hope for a lot of us. There's so much work that's still left to do, and I'm thankful that at the Williams we get to do it. There's any donors there, just funding us, because there's so much more data that we can gather and really support our communities. Thank you.
Thanks, Miguel. Talia, Miguel did a great job, laying out these disparities that exist for LGBT immigrants. I wonder if you can kind of speak more broadly to the policy context. I'm probably not alone in being pessimistic about the prospects of comprehensive immigration reform anytime soon. So how is the political debate around the border and sort of migration more broadly impacting services and resources for LGBTQ people in California?
Yeah, thanks for the question. You're definitely not alone in that. And one of the areas of focus at the Center for Immigration Law and Policy here at UCLA is thinking about the role that states and localities can play in moving immigration reform in part because of the federal, not just gridlock, but really toxicity of what's happening at the federal level and has been happening for a long time. And I think that the impacts, I don't want to be all negative here. I think there are both positive and negative impacts of what's happening at the federal level on what we're seeing at the state and local. So I will start with the negative just so we can end on a high note. But the gap left by the federal government's just complete failure to reform our immigration system has left a gaping hole that hostile states led by our friends in Texas, or if anybody here is from Texas, are just racing to fill with dangerous policies that are really endangering people's lives. And so just one easy example that you've probably read about in the news recently is SB 4. This is Texas's state law that is attempting to enforce federal immigration law to arrest and deport people who they suspect are in the country unlawfully, not both at the border, but anywhere in the state. Regardless of whether there's an ongoing immigration proceeding. So the law actually explicitly says, we don't care if there's an ongoing federal immigration proceeding. If we find you and we think you're here unlawfully, we have authority to arrest and deport you. That law is now on pause after a roller coaster ride up to the Supreme Court, back to the Fifth Circuit. It is on pause right now. It did go into effect for some number of hours. It's on pause now, but as Miguel shared, like who is the target of that law, right? Who are going to be the targets? Who is profiled whenever there's a law that targets enforcement? The first people in the line of in sort of the line of fire are those that are the same people that are profiled by our criminal legal system, folks of color, trans folks who are marked as different, and that is going to be no different in Texas, just like it wasn't in Arizona for SB 1070. So this gaping hole at the federal level is creating opportunities again and again at the state level, and I could give a whole bunch of examples, right, for states to come in and create negative policies. The stagnation at the federal level is also, as Miguel sort of alluded to, because the federal government isn't able to do basic things like provide work permits on a time, even to people who qualify for them, right, or make findings about people's legal status, because a lot of folks have very strong claims and in fact are clearly eligible for relief under our existing immigration laws. And still, it takes years and years. Now it's something like 4.5 years for an asylum case is the average time for an asylum case in the non-detained immigration court context. And so when you are leaving people in that kind of limbo who are unable to access work permits so that they can support themselves or access some benefits programs that states and localities may provide because they don't have the legal status, it creates real problems. In California, we do have some programs that try to remedy that. And California has been a leader in that with its Food for All program, and now Health for All just went into effect. So there should be at least somewhat more access. And if you do this study, I hope 5 years from now, you'll find somewhat more access, but it's not perfect, and California is certainly not the whole country. So, so there's a real negative follow-on effect from the toxic federal immigration gridlock, but it also has created opportunities. I think it's lit a fire under I won't use the word, but it's lit a fire in certain places, and in California has in some ways been one of those places. So it's opened up opportunities for states and localities to kind of push the ball forward. They don't have the excuse of like the feds aren't doing it. Everybody knows the feds aren't doing it. What can we do to step up? And we have done that in some important ways in California. The state of California has invested in welcoming infrastructure for folks at the border. The county, even the county of San Diego, which is a relatively conservative county, has put money and resources towards the welcoming infrastructure, as has the nonprofit service community and faith communities coming together to create a welcoming infrastructure. Just one example is the San Diego Rapid Response Shelter that Jewish Family Services runs, again, with support from the state and from the county. They provide respite shelter, emergency medical care that's LGBTQI sensitive, and onward travel assistance. Amazing operation if you haven't been down there. The LA Welcome Collective right here in LA, taking folks who are arriving on these buses that from Texas and from Florida and providing immediate triage services for people. That is coming some from our city and county coffers. So there are models of that. And since we're on UCLA's campus, I also want to give a plug for the queer undocumented youth on this campus who have done an unbelievable job in our Opportunity for All campaign, which is a campaign to get the University of California to ensure equal opportunities to work on campus for its undocumented students, saying DACA is, doesn't help us anymore. Most of the undocumented students coming onto campuses today are not eligible for DACA. They are aged out of DACA. DACA is not accepting new applications, and undocumented youth on this campus, and particularly queer undocumented youth, have really led the fight to fill that gap right here at the UC. So there are lots of opportunities that we can take if we want to, if we have the will in our states and localities. And unfortunately, California is now in this budget cycle kind of pulling back on that, proposing budget cuts that will take away from some of these programs, including this welcoming infrastructure and other legal services programs for immigrants. So we have not won the battle, but I think there are really a lot of opportunities created here at the state and local level that we can create to push the ball forward while we're sort of in this world where nothing is likely to happen at the federal level.
Thanks, Talia. Kennji, I wonder if I can sort of kick that back to you. We have an election coming up. We're likely to have one of two outcomes. I wonder, to start, what you perhaps are most concerned about under a prospective Trump administration when it comes to these issues, and if there's a second Biden term where you ostensibly see opportunities for change.
Okay, let's start with Trump. We'll get that out of the way. I mean, the former president has been clear in his statements of late that he would institute some kind of mass roundup and deportation scheme, that he would create camps. He has a lot of very hostile rhetoric towards people of immigrant backgrounds. To what extent those things are actually implementable, is questionable. But if you look at what's called the mandate for leadership, which is what the Heritage Foundation puts out every presidential election cycle, you can get a sense of what more sort of granular policy ideas they're thinking. And the last time around, the Trump administration 1.0, I guess you could call it, implemented about 60% of those ideas. So, you know, they do look to these kinds of guides in what they're planning. And this one was written by a former administration official. So, I mean, it's probably nothing we couldn't imagine, but it's terrible. So, you know, a massive increase in detention, a return to all of the policies the Trump administration tried before, in addition to unwinding, like many of the positive things this administration has tried, at least on an administrative level. They would even stop, in order to get around some things that are in law, they would essentially use backlogs at the immigration agency to stop processing applications. So they can't, you know, remove these things from US law without Congress, but they can just create gridlock to stop processing DACA renewals, for example, or to stop processing visas for victims of crime or victims of domestic violence, so the U and VAWA provisions. It goes on and on. I don't know. I don't need to make us any more concerned than we already are. But I think on the other side, it is true that Congress has not acted in many years to update or modernize US immigration laws, and the fight around the supplemental that included the appropriation supplemental that included some border provisions, for better or for worse, depending on your perspective, showed again that Congress was, you know, unable to reach an agreement. But there are things the administration has done at a sub-legislative level that they'll probably continue to try. Some of those are the pathways. So using parole authority to enhance the availability of sort of safe and regular routes to the US that avoid the travel over the Darien Gap and through Mexico. So those have been available to only a set number of nationalities and people. They might try to enhance those or to you know, expand the availability of those. The other area that there have been advances is in refugee resettlement. So there's now different sort of sponsorship models as opposed to the way refugee resettlement worked before, which was that someone arrives, they're assigned to a refugee settlement agency like IRC, and then they're placed in the community. Now, universities, employers, and individuals or groups of individuals can sponsor refugees, and there's a pathway now open where you can name the person who you want to sponsor. So this is being used, I think, mainly by refugee communities who unfortunately were separated from more distant family members who weren't eligible for resettlement when they first came to the US. And that's a pathway I think that is interesting for queer communities as well, because it means you would be able to nominate someone who is a friend or a family member, whatever it might be, by name for resettlement. And similarly, you could sponsor someone for these pathways, these parole pathways. You know, one thing that has been difficult is to see, you know, what are the impacts of those policies on queer people? Are they being made accessible, or are they predominantly being used by people to, you know, sponsor relatives or whatever it might be? So they're available, but it's not clear yet, I think, how accessible they are for queer folks and whether they're being able to use those.
Thanks. I have more questions, but I see we're running up on time, so I want to open it up to the audience. If there are any questions. Yeah, please.
I'm just wondering, your question to Talia about immigration and the sort of cohort of LGBT immigrants to the United States. I was wondering what the Links Institute's work on the Global Acceptance Index, if that says anything about the influx of LGBT into the United States.
Well, I think, thanks for letting me log roll our Global Acceptance Index. For those who don't know, this is an index that our colleague Andrew Flores led on years ago, and we continue to update, that measures public attitudes and acceptance of LGBTI people and their rights across 175 countries, drawing on public opinion data from a number of different polls to kind of get at people's attitudes and some measure of social acceptance toward LGBTI people. And it's a way at kind of a macro level to measure changes in public acceptance of LGBTI people, so we can see different countries and regions and how that changes over time. I think it's, it can be a useful tool for helping to understand sort of global landscape of where LGBTI people face more or less accepting context, right? Just to take even recent examples from the news, Uganda, just the other day, the Constitutional Court there upheld, for the most part, the Anti-Homosexuality Act, which is among the most draconian anti-LGBTI laws in the world. Countries from Russia to Ghana, Kenya, other countries where anti-LGBTI laws are either being sort of further institutionalized or being considered by legislatures, invariably is sort of factored into public stigma and anti-LGBTI sentiment. So I think the Global Acceptance Index can help us sort of see those trends, but again, without more data in terms of who's actually entering the country, who's applying for asylum, it's hard to fully sort of connect the dots. I don't know if, yeah.
Well, actually, I want to plug in another index that we have. The legal environment index, because it seems that your question relates more about what's the legal framework out here, like if the US actually doing it. Because at the end of the day, as is being explained in this panel, law may say something, policy may say something, but the reality may be different. So yeah, I guess if the US has this kind of legislation, something that can be measured, and the legal environment index that we are just updating right now, expect that report soon, actually measures different legal provisions that support LGBT rights, anti-discrimination laws, provisions towards education, health, participation in military, and that's across sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, and sex characteristics. So I think like for further update, we could try to find out if, including that index, if there are provisions to protect LGBT immigration across the world that I guess could further help us advance that. But I think at the end, we need to know what's going on in terms of policy implementation beyond that. The social perception of it or the laws around it, but I guess that's just another project that we can take on.
Yeah, please.
Hi, I've been passing out some article around this whole thing of the anti-LGBT Republican, let's just put fascist, Christian theocratic movement on a level that won't accept a loss in an election. I mean, there's an elephant in the room that there's an election coming up and that they will just go down the field. They may win for one thing in America. The other thing is that, and with that forensics program, which is also combined with the war on women, the war on every single thing. That's the reality. But the thing on immigration right now and climate change and all of these things, these are huge. We have to confront the fact that, I don't know if you've seen the ProPublica Love Garden articles on Central America, and what's actually forcing people to have to cross those borders. Massive changes in the ecosystems that the country is responsible for, frankly. And then you have this thing that's going on in Texas. My understanding from my friends in Texas who were at the border when Abbott brought the National Guard in, and we're holding a sign that said, "America, this is not an immigration problem, it's an imperialism problem." They held that sign at Eagle Pass. The fact that you have the Border Patrol and the National Guard facing off against each other, you have two sets of forces in the government, both of them, and then Biden, what does he do? He throws a bunch of immigrants under the bus as a way to be able to win over the middle with his latest, I'm going to be tough on this too. We have a horrific situation of many contradictions. And we have to get really deeply into what we're facing this November, which I'm sorry, this is metastasized. I voted last time for Biden just because I wanted to stop fascism. This is beyond that now. These people have military now. If you watch New York and the funeral of that cop, they have the police force of the nation on their side. This is a huge, formidable, this is a huge force that's coming up. And then how do you actually navigate within that? Yes, you fight for every legal position, but what are we actually facing? What's the conversation we have to have about what's actually happening on the macro?
Yeah, thank you. Did anyone?
I mean, I usually, yeah, I mean, I don't think anybody here is trying to sugarcoat the problem, you know, I think it is a massive problem that we face. I think we have two choices, as you said. Like, so during the election, we can either just like pack our bags and go home and say like, we're done, this is not what. Yeah, but we wanna. Yeah, or we need to figure out how we can move forward, and I do think, you know, as I shared before, you know, states and localities, you know, progressive states and localities like can push the ball forward. We shouldn't be sitting here waiting for anybody else to do our work for us. We need to be pushing the ball forward. We can also still fight back in the courts. I mean, we just won one of the things Texas has done is these parole programs that Kennji was talking about. Texas sued to get rid of that program, said like, we don't want these. They didn't sue the Ukraine program, but they sure sued the program helping people from Cuba, Haiti, and Nicaragua and Venezuela. They took the federal government to court and said that program's illegal. And we intervened, right, on behalf of people, US sponsors, and we just won in the Southern District of Texas, and the program's still going, you know, so thank you. It's incredibly exciting. But so I think it's not, you know, there are massive problems. But there are like we don't have a choice. It's our lives, it's our home, right? We can't stop fighting. And I do think that there are ways to do that in the courts, there are ways to do that on the streets, as your friends are doing at Eagle Pass, and there are ways to do that with our states and localities. And I hope we're all in it for this fight, because it's a big one.
This is clearly a robust conversation that could easily use another hour, but I see we're up at time. So I want to thank all of my incredible panelists, and thank you all for the conversation.